A self-identified apathist who takes pictures of shit marries an optimist in 1970s New York City. A confrontational stand-up comedian's relationship with an opera singer leads to murder. And a baby with a beautiful singing voice. What do Alan Arkin's Little Murders and Leos Carax's Annette have to do with each other? Let's find out.
I mean, what do you think? You think they stand a chance? Well, you're on their side, aren't you? Who are you betting on,
Magic mirror on the wall. Who is the fairest one of all?
Look at these lies.
One shall stand, one shall fall.
Even if one of them survives,
the only way to stop him is to make another movie.
Welcome to the Celluloid Mirror. I am one of your hosts, Sean Mannion.
And I am the other one of your hosts. I am Nicole Solomon. And on the Celluloid Mirror, we take two films and look at what they reflect about one another, the audience, and our culture at large. Today, we are talking about Leos Carax's Annette and Alan Arkin's Little Murders.
We'll start by giving a brief synopsis of each film, discuss our response to the film's critical response, and then we're going to dive in on what the films say about each other and maybe about you. You specifically, who are listening right now. What does it say about you? How should you feel bad about yourself because of this movie? These movies, either of these movies, both, all of these movies, every movie. I really want you to feel bad at the end of this podcast.
I would say these two certainly implicate the audience to a degree, so yeah. Appropriate. We got to give synopses of these films, don't we, Sean?
We do. And what are we going to do in these synopses, Nicole?
We're going to tell people about what happens in the film. So if you have not watched Little Murders and Annette and you are concerned about spoilers for either film, feel free to hit pause right now, watch those fine films, and come back to us later. But of course, I believe you would probably enjoy these films even if you hear us talk about them first, as is the case with most quality films, of which, spoiler, I think these two are. Sean, would you like to spoil
Nicole.
Annette?
I would like to spoil Annette, but I think I'll describe this movie called Annette first. So Leos Carax's Annette is about, it's a musical, and it's an opera, or it's intended to be an opera, which doesn't mean a whole lot to me because I've never actually seen an opera. I'm not even pronouncing the word properly.
You're pronouncing it better.
I have improved upon the opera with my pronunciation, with my new pronunciation of it. Anyway, it's supposed to be that it is conceived by the long-running borderline underground, not quite really, band Sparks, and it starts and ends, I'm just going to put this out there, it starts and ends by sort of showing its artifice, by showing cast and crew as part of like setup, and then later breaking down the film. And then we see the story play out, and the story follows two performers, a opera singer and a stand-up comedian. Opera singer played by Marion Cotillard, and the stand-up comedian played by Adam Driver. And so two very different sorts of characters. She's just sort of this somewhat shy singer, and he is a very sort of confrontational, like in people's faces, very theatrical stand-up comedian performer. And we find that they're in a relationship, they're in love. We know this because they have a song that is about how much they are in love with each other while they're fucking. among other things.
They love each other so much.
They love each other so much. I was trying to remember exactly the words. And you know this because it gets repeated. That's the whole song. There's a couple,
I think there's
a couple
words.
other words, but that's most of the song. Which,
counterintuitive, baby, and yet we remain. We love each other so much.
There you go.
Few other similar additional lyrics, but it's primarily just
it's
the repeating incantation of sorts.
Yeah,
We
which
love
is
each other
very
so
much like what Sparks music I have listened to, not all of it, but some of it for sure. Their pairing results in a baby, and also discontent for Adam Driver, the stand-up comedian, and his career starts to falter, and hers is fine. There are some revelations about his behavior in past relationships that would be very familiar, I think, to an audience in 2021, and that he has perhaps been abusive.
No,
and
actually,
what?
That was a dream. That was a dream.
I took it as a dream of something that happened. Like that it was a dream, but it was something that happens that actually happens.
I don't think there's anything. It could have happened. Sorry, not to cut you off, but I don't think there's any evidence that actually happened. I think it's her fears.
Okay. So perhaps it did not happen. But in the film, there is a sequence in which, whether it's entirely in her dreams, which,
because how would she know that?
it's framed in the dreams, but it's also like a news thing, but it's not. It makes sense that it's just an expression of her fears, but it also kind of makes sense that it would be a thing that actually happened, that they kind of she kind of let slide, and other people have let slide. Like, but regardless,
Sure.
there is this thing which is sort of indicative of that he perhaps has a history of, or she's afraid that he has a history of, or that she's afraid of how he's behaving, basically, towards her, and his
anger specifically.
And his anger specifically. And their relationship starts to deteriorate. His career starts to deteriorate. Hers is doing well. They go out on their boat with the baby. There's a storm, and she goes overboard. I wasn't really super clear on. He's drunk. I wasn't really super clear on if he's pushed her off. He pushed her off.
Well,
yeah. Okay.
Do you want my interpretation after?
Just go ahead and interpret.
Having because that moment absolutely is a moment I've questioned, and having watched it 4 times now, I pay a lot of attention to that, and every time it's a bit ambiguous. He's drunk. Mm-hmm. He's on the boat. She comes out to get him to come inside. He won't come inside. He's like, let's waltz. We're going to waltz instead. Yes. And he's being a dick. And she's begging him to come in. And at a certain point, he pushes her away and she goes off the boat. I don't necessarily think he consciously, intentionally was trying to push her off the boat, but he was also doing something that 12,000% could result in exactly that. This was a bad storm. This was nobody should have been out there in the first place.
They shouldn't have been out there in the first place. I think it's one of those things where, yeah, it's kind of ambiguous. Did he mean to push her, or was
it might be a manslaughter versus murder situation, yes. I would say. But it's manslaughter. He still kills her regardless.
He's still responsible. I don't think there's a question about that.
Whatever his exact intent was, he's absolutely responsible. Yes.
Exactly. So this happens. She dies. He's suspected of things. The police come and question him, but he's cleared of it. And so he's the only one. Well, he's not the only one taking care of the baby. There's a babysitter. And then he discovers that the baby whose name is Annette, the name of the film. The baby has a beautiful singing voice. And so he starts exploiting the baby Annette for her singing voice, and hooks in this pianist who had became a conductor, and hooks him in to say like, hey, we're going to do this thing and there's going to be a big tour. And the conductor reveals to the audience that he had a passing a brief relationship with Annette's mother right before she got with Adam Driver's character. And right before, I can't remember Adam Driver's character's name.
Henry McHenry.
Henry McHenry, that's it. So Henry, right before Anne connected with Henry, they had a little something. So he has a certain suspicion about Henry and Henry's intentions and what happened with Anne. Anyway, this turns into a huge sort of career for little Annette, and she's doing big concerts all over the place, getting very famous. He kind of is Henry starts to kind of live through her for the fame, until he's finally confronted by the pianist turned conductor about what happened, and about what's the song? The thing that triggers it is one of the songs. I'm spacing which song it is.
Annette starts singing the "We Love Each Other So Much" song.
That's it. So and he's frustrated by that because he's like, how does she know that song? What is this?
That was my special thing with my dead wife.
Exactly. Conductor's, the one who kind of showed it to her. And
actually, that was my special thing with your dead wife.
Yeah.
We sang that shit to each other before you all got together is what that was.
Which ultimately leads to Henry killing the conductor, and then saying like, oh, Annette is retiring. We're going to do one big last final show, which the big last final show ends with no singing, just Annette saying, "Daddy kills people." I think that's the exact line, but it's pretty much that. Daddy kills people on live stream around the world at some version of the Super Bowl.
The Hyper Bowl, I believe.
The Hyper Bowl, yeah. No, it's
something
amazing.
Like that.
It's amazing, and he ends up in prison for it, and the film ends with Annette confronting her father, and basically stating what is sort of shown throughout the film, which is that he really can't love other people the way he is or the way he treats people, and abandoning him there because it's kind of what he deserves in that point because of how he is. Key to part of the visuals of this is that Annette is a puppet for 99% of her appearances in the film until the very end, where she actually speaks to him and tells him that he can't love properly.
Not her, at least.
Yeah, not her. And that's where it leaves it, except for the end bit that I was mentioning at the beginning, where you see the whole cast and crew. They're walking along,
and multiple puppets, multiple Annette puppets.
Yes,
from different stages of her babyhood.
Yeah, because there's a bunch of different puppets. It's an interesting set of puppets for the baby, and that is Annette in a very loose, probably missing a lot of it sort of way.
It's a very long movie, so I would hope you missed some of it in the synopsis. Yeah. It is a 2-hour and 20-minute long movie. Yeah. And as it should be. I would watch 5 hours of Annette, but that's me. So, Little Murders, shall I?
Yes, go for it. But don't spoil it.
So Little Murders is a 1971, I guess, what the note says here, film directed by Alan Arkin. And this was his feature film debut, interestingly. Directorial debut, at least.
Yeah. He'd been acting for a while.
Yeah, he'd been acting, but directing, I mean. And stars Elliott Gould, a young early 70s Elliott Gould, which is a fine period of Elliott Gould, as well as Marcia Rod. And it's based on a play, this weirdo 1960s play by Jules Feiffer, the cartoonist, if anyone is familiar with his work, which I grew up, I think my parents liked him or something. I was very aware of Jules Feiffer as a cartoonist and humorist growing up, and he wrote this weirdo play, and Elliott Gould really wanted to make it into a movie, and they made it into a movie eventually. And it's about Marcia Rod plays a character called Patty Newquist, and she's an interior designer living in New York City, and it's a New York that's kind of this like over-the-top caricature of kind of the image of New York City that became popularized through 1970s films, in part because I believe that's when they started shooting a lot more in New York again, and it happened to coincide with like all sorts of chaos happening. So, you know, it wasn't just the normal New York, it was New York during the garbage strike. So there was like garbage piled, etc. There's this New York City version that, you know, a lot of the country and perhaps world had in their heads specifically because of 1970s film. Some people think that is still what New York City is like. And this isn't that exactly, but it's almost like this whacked out, exaggerated version of that a little before the fact, where it's just like, there's just like crime and noise and obscene phone calls and blackouts and ongoing all the time, people getting murdered all the time and it not being solved. And so Patty is an optimist. She's a very positive person. She doesn't want other people to steal her joy, basically. And she sees out her window this man being attacked by people. So she goes outside and intervenes and is shocked to find that the victim, who is Elliott Gould, doesn't even thank her. He's like, whatever, they were going to get tired out soon. And she's like, what's wrong with you? What's going on with you? And finds herself kind of compelled by him, in part perhaps because she's a fixer-upper kind of lady. She likes to find men who are broken and try to fix them. I don't recommend that if anybody out there is looking at that as a...
I don't think that's realistic. I don't think I've met any person who actually tries to do that.
Yeah, never. That's totally not a thing. Or totally a primary dynamic in a lot of male-female heterosexual relationships, especially, that can be bad for both parties or anything. Not at all.
Never heard of that. So it's totally made up.
No. So she ends up attracted to this guy, Alfred Chamberlain, played by Elliott Gould, who's a photographer. He now takes photos specifically of shit. He like actual shit on the street and makes a living out of this now in like, you know, turn of the 60s into the 70s. He used to shoot people and do more professional photography, but as he explains to her, he found the people just kind of growing more and more out of focus. He was just less and less able to photograph people rather than objects, and eventually all he could photograph was shit. So that's what he does now. Otherwise, he's pretty emotionally vacant. He doesn't really feel much pain or pleasure beyond he says he likes his work. He likes to do his work. When people are beating him up, he just disassociates and thinks about his work. So that's his coping mechanism, basically, is he goes through life whenever he gets in a rough spot. He doesn't fight back. As he says, and I was like, that's pretty astute. He's basically like, if someone wants to beat you up, they're going to beat you up. There's no right answer, you know? Like, they asked me what I was looking at, you know? And it's like, if I say I was, you know... I don't remember the exact thing, but it's like basically whatever I do, they're either going to be offended or they're going to think I'm a cop or they're going to this or they're going to that. There's no right answer. It all ends with me taking a beating anyway. So like, why even bother?
Why bother?
yeah, why bother? I'm just going to disassociate and go to my happy place, which is me taking photos of shit, and let them do what they're going to do until they get tired out. And Patsy's like, I can't handle this. Like, how can you go through life like this? And she brings him home to meet her family. And it's a very long scene, which is part of how you know you're watching a movie based on a play that's keeping a lot of the structure of the acts of the play. Basically, like, the whole rest of Act 1 is them just at her family's New York City apartment. She's got a weirdo brother who's got like a weird kind of inappropriate seeming relationship with her.
Yeah.
And seems kind of off in general. He learns that Patsy had another brother who was murdered for some unknown reason, and the murder was never solved. You know, he doesn't really care about families, but like Patsy wants to get married to him, and he like agrees because it'll make her happy, basically, because he's like, whatever, I can be married or not. He's like an extremely passive protagonist. Like it's almost like as an exercise, they were like, how can we make the most passive protagonist who literally just goes along with whatever? So they announce the engagement. And they're surprised, and there's an awkward long dinner scene, and then there's a very funny wedding where Donald Sutherland plays like this weirdo hippie pastor, and it's kind of a chaotic free-for-all of various sorts. It's a lot of 60s chaos. And whatever, they're married then. They continue with their life, Patsy trying to get Alfred to kind of engage with the world more, try for things, have hope, passions, whatever. He's resistant, but at a certain point, he's kind of like a bit compelled by her, you know, idea that maybe you should give a shit. Wild ideas, I know. And at a certain point, like, he actually agrees with her, and he's like, yes. And specifically, crucially, he agrees that he's going to try to be the kind of guy who will fight back and not just let people do whatever they want to him. And as soon as he says that, this is right around the end of Act 2, some unknown assailant fires a gun through their window, shooting and killing her. And she dies in his arms, literally. And then he, in a fugue state, leaves the house covered in blood, goes and like rides the subway. It's a very funny scene where I was telling Sean before the show, at a certain point, someone all the seats are taken on the subway. At a certain point, someone gets up and off at a stop, and Alfred, totally covered in blood, just goes and sits in his spot on like this very crowded bench right next to other people who kind of look at him and like notice the blood and are kind of like, oh, that's weird, but then just go about their business. And
yeah, because that's just the subway.
Yeah, that's just the subway. Exactly. So he, you know, goes to the parents' apartment and, like, you know, is in this stupor. He's basically, like, unable to react. I think he tells them that she's dead, I believe, and then, like, a police detective shows up and drops by and talks a lot about how many unsolved murders there are in the city and all of that, and is clearly useless. Alfred goes for a walk. He comes back with a rifle. He doesn't really know how to use it, but Patsy's father shows him how. And then the two of them and Patsy's brother end up taking turns shooting strangers through their window and laughing maniacally about it, which leads Patsy's mom to say, oh, it's so great to see my family laughing again. For a moment, I was getting really worried, but now everything's fine because there's joy in the house again that is coming from the men in her family inflicting murderous violence against random strangers out the window. And then they all are happy and they eat dinner together. And that is Little Murders.
That is
right?
Little Murders. Yes.
Yeah. That's what happens in that movie. You want me to talk about the connections between them?
Yes.
Cool. Well, to me, the main thing is these are both films about very different forms of dysfunctional masculinity that in the form of characters who then marry women who are very different from them and are kind of set up to save them in one way or another, or help them counterbalance whatever's wrong with them to help keep them, in the land of the living and become better people. Both of these women die. I've watched Little Murders now twice. The first time I saw it, because the structure is a little weird in part based on the play, I thought at first that Patsy died halfway through the film. That's not true. Mm-hmm. It's really very much end of Act 2.
Very much.
Whereas in Annette, Annette very much dies middle of Act 2. Annette very much dies. It's literally the exact halfway point of the film. It's the
midpoint of the movie, yeah.
But they are both movies where she dies with the husband present. In Little Murders, Elliott Gould doesn't kill her, but is, in terms of his words and the logic of the film, it responsible to a degree in her death, kind of. So there's a connection there. And they're both films that are kind of dealing with masculinity and critiquing heteropatriarchal romantic and familial relationship structures. And they both also have this like stage element that I thought was interesting in that.
Yeah, they're both start as stage things.
Yeah, Little Murders is based on a play, and Annette was originally supposed to be a musical.
It was supposed to be a stage musical, yeah.
Sparks wrote it as an opera. They planned to tour with it. They ended up making a movie with Leos Carax instead. That's also where the puppet element came from, which I think is really interesting, is that Sparks were like, well, we can't have a kid tour with us or anything like that.
Right.
Why don't we do this stylized thing of we'll have a bassinet with a doll in it. Originally, it wasn't going to be a puppet. It was going to be a doll. And have the music play or whatever. And then when Leos Carax wanted to make the film, he was just like, oh yeah, we're keeping that part. And they were like, okay. But then it really, I think, works as a very powerful metaphor in the film as well.
No, I think it works very well there. I would slightly disagree that, and this is something that we can discuss further down the line, that their manifestations are that different of the toxic masculinity.
Sure.
I would say that they're very, very similar, but we can talk about that more.
Yeah, that sounds interesting. Yes, I felt that there was a connection between their versions of toxic masculinity.
Yeah.
And then the pivotal death. And neither, we were talking before the show a little bit, neither is really a fridging death. It's not the thing of when the romantic partner dies to give motivation to the protagonist. It's not that at all. It's arguably, something that's really counter to that whole thing, actually.
Yeah. Not necessarily the opposite, but it's definitely not that. It's definitely not that, which, like, it does not inspire them to do more. But it doesn't inspire them to do more. And it doesn't,
certainly doesn't inspire them to do better.
Much reaction. No.
There's certainly not any sorts of revenge or vengeance films either.
No. Not really.
They're about bad people becoming worse, you could say. So how do we feel about these films? When did we see them? What did we think? When did you first watch these films, and what did you think about them?
Annette, I watched over last week. I had to break it up a little bit just because of life. And I've been meaning to watch it for months, but hadn't gotten to it quite yet because I saw reference to it in the Sparks Brothers documentary. Looked like it was going to be an interesting thing. It was kind of nice to see in one of those docs that they reference something new coming up from the subject, and that it was coming up right away, basically. So watched it over the weekend. I really enjoyed it. I like a musical. I liked in particular the puppet, and like how the puppet sort of visually like what you talked about how the puppet was sort of a taken from, it was going to be a stage show, and then the puppet is very, very visually representative of the relationship between Henry and Annette, his daughter. That clicked right away. Like, as soon as I was like, oh, puppet, oh, I see what's going on. Like, at first I was just like, this is an interesting way to do it. And then when it becomes clear what they're doing, why they're doing it, like, this is great. When they chose to change her to be an actual child actor, I was also very much appreciated. Like, there's I think that was a very well executed part of the film. I like a lot of, honestly, I like a lot of how Henry is a deconstruction of a particular type of performer, who's very recognizable, who ends up being a very popular type of performer. And I think one of the reasons, in my synopsis, I kind of interpret that press conference, that's her dream, as being a real thing, because that would be a real thing for that kind of performer. Like, that would happen. Like,
absolutely.
And has happened. And I think, that particular deconstruction I really liked, and is very timely. It's a very timely movie. And I think it's nice to see a very timely movie with the kind of perspective that this has. Coming from people who are more likely to be Henry McHenry in most contexts than not. Like, I'd read a little bit in one of the articles that we could talk about later, about how there was some interpretation of, or there's some discussion of how some of it seems to be not necessarily autobiographical or semi-autobiographical about Leos Carax. Not really, but kind of mirrors some of his personal life.
And that his wife died?
And that his wife died, and he's got his daughter with him. And I guess his daughter is in some of the opening sequence stuff. So there's something interesting about that, and just sort of reflective there. So I really enjoyed that. Little Murders I watched a month ago, give or take. It was about to leave Criterion. So I made sure to watch it before this. Really enjoyed it. I really like... it was just weird. And it's one of those ones that you're like, I watched that and I have an impression of what that is, but I'm not sure I could entirely tell you what happened to the movie. Like, but I have an impression of that movie and that character. And, it definitely has that stagey feel to it. And it is, as I think you mentioned, it's like peak Elliott Gould. And then also, while you were describing it, I hadn't forgotten that Donald Sutherland was in it, but I remembered that they were both, that this would be like the year after they both did MASH, which is a movie I personally really, really enjoy, and can't get into the TV show because I'm just like, okay, but where's Elliott Gould and Donald Sutherland? And that's another one where the main character is very recognizable, and I appreciate the way that he's recognizable. And the Patsy, who he marries, is also like one of those, like, this is an absurd film with sort of almost disturbingly real characters. Like, you just pluck these people out and it sort of grounds the absurdity in a way, even though they seem like they're sort of caricatures, but they're not really. You're just like,
they're kind of extreme, but
like,
they're
you're like,
extreme
oh, but I
of
know
very
that
real
person.
people.
Yeah, but you're like, but I know that person. Like, and so it's very good, and it also, I really appreciate that one in that sense. So both very new watches for me. Both ones I want to watch more, and because I feel like both of them are those types of movies which I like, which are movies that the more you watch them, like, I can tell, I'm like, I'm gonna see more every time I watch these movies, and I'll like them more every time I watch these movies. So those are my personal reactions to the films. What are your personal reactions to the films, Nicole?
Well, I've found what you said to be true. I've, at this point, seen them both at least 2 times. Annette, I watched when it first became available this summer, streaming on Amazon. I'd heard about it at Cannes, and where it, won some awards and was very polarizing. And I knew it was like the Adam Driver, Marion Cotillard sex scene musical is basically all I knew. I didn't know the plot. I didn't know a lot of things. But I was like, yeah, I'm going to watch the Adam Driver musical, obviously, basically, because I really like Adam Driver. And I am interested in musicals. And I'm also interested in movies having sex scenes again. So I want to support that. Mm-hmm. And I watched it and was just like, what the fuck was that? I loved it. The first time I saw it, but I was really struck by it, and I've had quite an emotional experience with it also, which is interesting because I've read some criticism being like, there's no emotion. I'm like, this moved me more than most movies I've seen. This movie guts me every time I watch it. That's part of why I watch it, to feel something.
There's no emotion
like, I didn't know
in it? We should talk about that later, but like
people. I was really struck by it. I think Adam Driver, he's one of my favorite actors working today. I think he is so great, and he's so great at taking a character like this, and however angry you may be at the character, you still want to watch the character. I was fascinated by him, whereas let's be real, people kind of like him in real life are a lot less fascinating to watch than he is playing that kind of guy. Yeah. And I didn't know where the film was going. I didn't know Marion Cotillard was going to die in the first act. I was like, I'm so taken by this relationship. This relationship, even though it's kind of between two archetypes of sorts, felt like such a more real and fully realized and complex and nuanced and not wholly good adult relationship. And I was just like, and I remember talking to my husband about, we were watching it together and we're like, we're so into like this, just watch this relationship, not because like the relationship is goals or whatever, but just like because, oh, this feels like a real relationship. So interesting. And Adam Driver's a dick, but I wanted him to be better. I felt invested in his character because he felt like a real person. And so when he pushes Marion Cotillard and she dies, I felt like heartbroken. I felt heartbroken that she was dead. And I felt heartbroken that this is what had happened with this character, that this guy like couldn't get it together at all, that he just had to go to that place. And I felt heartbroken for their puppet baby. And I also think the music is beautiful. It gets stuck in my head all of the time. Some of it I think is very funny. It was just like the emotion and the humor, because it's a very funny movie also to me. It has lines that make me laugh just to remember them. And then being like, oh, this is a film about a narcissist and relationships, like kids with narcissist parents is a big part of what this film is about. And I was worried watching it that they were going to kind of redeem Henry McHenry in some way. And the only redemption is that he ultimately accepts responsibility for what he's done. But he is not rewarded in any way, shape, or form. He ends up in prison alone with literally his daughter saying, he's like, you know, literally his daughter's like, now you have no one to love. And he's like, but can I love you? And she says, no, not really. That happens a couple times over the course of this heartbreaking song they do together, where he finally sees her as a person separate from him and not a puppet, as he's been imagining her for this entire time, but her own independent person who he has to say goodbye from to and detach from. And his only solace and reward is maybe he can't hurt people anymore. And I was just like, damn, I'm not used to seeing characters like this get treated that way, where they get to be both the protagonist of the film, where they're a fully formed person. Henry McHenry is by far the most developed character in this film. And he's the protagonist. It's about him and it's about his shit. And it really doesn't let him off the hook. No. And it really shows this is how bad this is, regardless of intentions, regardless of whatever. This is like how like truly evil this shit will get, even though he's a person. He's not a mustache twirling villain. He's not, you know, a genocidal alien trying to kill the human race. He's just fucking jerk in a way a lot of people are. And I love this film. It is also John Waters' favorite film of the year.
That makes sense.
I'm not sure if it's my favorite film, just in that there are a couple that are kind of in a tie, but it may as well be. It's certainly the film I've watched the most. I've watched this film 4 times. I watched it most recently within the past week just to prepare for the podcast because it had been a while since I'd seen it. But I watched it of my own volition 2 other times in between just because I was like, I want to watch that shit again. And it's free for me to watch, so I'm going to watch it. And I did. Little Murders I watched for the first time, I believe, in September when Criterion started this like New York City movies series on their streaming channel. Right. Yeah, and this was one of them. So I was just looking and I'm like, what's this weirdo Elliott Gould thing? Oh, I vaguely remember there being a plot line on Mad Men where like the daughter was trying out to be in this play. Interesting. Let's watch this. And I watched it and thought it was really interesting and unique. It's a weird movie. I felt throughout it, it's structurally very odd, in part because it was based on a somewhat odd to begin with play. So it doesn't really have the kind of film structure we're used to. And so I kind of never knew where I was in the film. I'm like, is this the halfway point? Or what's the plot here? I get that it's this relationship, but what's the plot? What is this very unusual protagonist with very unusual motivations and forces animating things? And I thought of Annette. I thought like, oh, interesting that I just saw fairly recently this other movie where very unexpectedly, because both deaths, the first time at least, to me felt out of the blue. On rewatch, they're foreshadowed, but first time watching,
in Annette, I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you.
There's a lot of foreshadowing in Annette, but I didn't know that. I did not see that happening. I could see picking up on it because now when I watch it, I'm like, how did I not get this? They foreshadow in so many ways.
I think because where, I think because of where I paused the movie between when I broke it in half, it was pretty apparent to me that what was going to happen.
You paused it basically like a few minutes before she dies.
In the middle of his performance, in which he's explicitly saying, "I killed my wife." So I jumped back another 15 minutes to make sure I rewatched like that chunk before that. So I'd watched that. I watched that part with the dream twice, and then I watched his performance twice. In any event, so I kind of was expecting it because of that, I think.
Having seen that stuff twice, and then right before I can see it, but like for me watching it for the first time, just going along, being like, where is this going? And being like, oh man, I don't want him to be terrible, and I didn't know that was going to come. But they're both pretty shocking, I would say. Even if you expected it, it's still kind of shocking deaths that happen in Act 2 of the film and then kind of set the destiny for the protagonist and his like kind of, slog to down their downward spiral and whatnot. So I was interested in the connections between the two. I was interested in the connections between the two in terms of studies of masculinity, critiques of the, heteropatriarchal romantic relationships and ideas about them, about those ideas about family as the building block of the state and whatnot, and how toxic that can be for people involved in it. All that sort of stuff. And my brain just started pinging about the connections between the two. And I did watch Little Murders again right before it left Criterion at the end of November, just to have it a little fresher in my mind. So I've seen that twice. I would watch it again. Annette, I would watch it more than one more time, but Annette, I will watch a lot because that seems to be one of those movies I just like to watch over and over and get more stuff out of it. But they are both, to Sean's point earlier, they are both the kind of movie that I do like more each time I see them. Little Murders I liked better the second time. Felt more like I had a handle on it a little bit. And because I knew where it was going, I was able to pay more attention to other details, which I found very rewarding. So I think they are both pretty rich texts that have a lot of elements that are worth talking about. And we're not the only people who talked about these films. I think a lot of critics have talked about them too, haven't they?
Did they? What did Roger Greenspun have to say? I always wonder about Roger Greenspun of the New York Times. I think about him often.
Who was writing right around the turn of the 70s?
Yeah.
Roger Greenspun?
I only just heard of him like today, but I often think about what does he think?
Sure. Well, do you want to tell us or do you want me to?
Well, why don't you tell us?
Well, he said, Roger Greenspun wrote in the New York Times when he reviewed the film Little Murders, I suspect that Little Murders, the play, has always been better drama and less social satire than many of its detractors or champions have been prepared to admit. Pfeiffer is such a brilliantly acute cartoonist that there has been a tendency to read Little Murders as an animated cartoon rather than accept the quite extraordinary theatricality of his drama of dark domestic comedy and maniacal declamation. Pfeiffer has no real reasons, no recognition of an order behind the disorder that is his film's central subject. Essentially, Little Murders constructs its world from the point of view of someone sitting behind the locked doors of an apartment on the Upper West Side. And so long as it maintains the conditions of that point of view, it works dramatically, cinematically, whatever way you will. Once it breaks those conditions, it becomes unterrifying, unfunny, superficial, inadequate. I don't know if I agree with that. But Little Murders is usually funny in its great harangues and sermons, in its superlative cast, and in Arkin's direct intelligence in handling most of the dramatic moments. So yeah, because this film, it's a very bleak comedy, I would call it. It's a comedy, but, you know...
It's that very specific type of comedy where it's not a comedy like people like your standard like mainstream comedy where it's like, oh, you're supposed to laugh every couple of minutes or every minute or whatever it is. The thing about like sitcoms where you're supposed to have at least a joke on every page or something like that. It's a comedy in a stage sort of sense of a comedy of in an almost like traditional theatrical sense of a comedy, in that like it, I mean, not entirely, because I think traditionally in theater, somebody's supposed to get married at the end and they get married in the middle or the beginning, I guess, of the movie. But beginning, I mean, it's a comedy.
Act 2.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Beginning of the movie ish. There. Sort of. Anyway, in the middle of the beginning. And but it's definitely a comedy. It's dramatic, but then so are a lot of them.
It's a scary comedy. It's a horror comedy of sorts, but not horror comedy like Elvira, Mistress of the Dark, which I also recently rewatched and is a fantastic film we should discuss on the show. Film. But scary, like actually scary. Because it's about real life. One point I want to make about it, this review doesn't specify this. Some reviews see it as specifically a satire of urban violence and decay. I did not see it that way, and from the expression on your face, it appears you didn't either. I saw it as very much about America, or U.S. America specifically. Not like, part of why I like it so much is it wasn't all like, man, New York City is like this. Its people are like this. And my understanding is Jules Pfeiffer was the Kennedy assassination was what kicked off this idea. Not like how bad things are in New York City. It was about a state of being in terms of violence in the United States. And it happened to be about New York City. And for those of us who live here, at least, I think we all probably really enjoy seeing New York City, and we're like, yeah, that's how it is. That's accurate, because we all get satisfaction out of, you know, taking pride in how shitty things can be here, and yet we live here. I mean, things are shitty everywhere. There's a lot of stuff great here, especially compared to a lot of this. Don't need to talk about any of this.
Talk about that later.
But point being, it's both a very New York movie, but also not. It doesn't have to be a New York movie.
It doesn't necessarily have to be a New York movie in a lot of ways. In a lot of ways, like there's a lot of like the ways in which people connect with one another, like physically, that I think is very New York. But that's one of the reasons that New York is always a good setting for drama and comedy. Because of the ways that very different people can come together like this movie. Like there's much more opportunity in your normal day-to-day for you to see a photographer getting beaten up on your street corner by a bunch of guys and go out there and you know, how they meet at the beginning.
There's more population density, if nothing else.
There's more population density. There's a lot more fluidity between like how people move between different areas. The fact that there's an actually functional public transit system, despite the fact that we all have many complaints about the public transit system, is an actually functional public transit system that works more often than it does not. Like there's just like, I think the ways in which people are like, oh, it's a very New York story. It's like, well, it's a very New York story just in the sense that it's easier to tell these stories in New York because it's more believable that these people would suddenly meet each other in New York.
Right. I don't feel like I agree. And I
like
don't
a shortcut.
Yeah. And I don't think Roger Greenspun's point that it works when it's like behind the locked doors of an Upper West Side apartment and needs to be from that point of view. And when they go beyond that, it doesn't work. I think that's I don't fully get that.
Yeah, I don't necessarily understand his point there. But hey, you know, Roger, he kind of misses sometimes, you know.
I don't get this whole unterrifying, unfunny, superficial, inadequate. I just don't. I mean, I guess he thinks it works as a satire of like specific New York types and doesn't otherwise, but that's like just a completely different way of viewing the whole film for me.
Yeah.
But it was overall a positive review, though. It had these quibbles, but it was like, yeah, this is good. It seems like it got, well, we'll talk about Rotten Tomatoes in a minute, but it got a lot of good reviews, as did Annette. Annette's a very polarizing film. A lot of people fucking hate it, but it has gotten a lot of positive reviews. A.O. Scott in the New York Times said that it's a musical about an ill-starred romance between two artists, a description that suggests obvious kinship with La La Land and A Star is Born. Not to play algorithm or anything, but if you like those movies, you'll probably like this one too, or maybe not. Emphasis on the maybe not.
Seen either of those movies. I'm not interested in La La Land, and I've decided that because there are 20 versions of A Star is Born, and I've never seen any of them, that I'm probably never going to see any of them.
I mean, I
understand how it's similar.
Well, it's similar in that they're musicals and they're based on a romantic relationship at the center, and they're all about white people.
And A Star is Born is
singing
about famous
English.
People and the change with like how one dude
they're all kind of about showbiz. That's true. They're all kind of about, and they all, but La La Land's not about that disintegration. And I've seen all these movies, and you know, La La Land's whatever. I never need to see it again. And A Star is Born similarly is kind of whatever. Like Lady Gaga did a good job. Like there's stuff about it that's good. I don't think it's that great a movie or something I particularly want to watch again. I think this is just, and as a musical, those are both like very conventional, whereas this is more not Brechtian, but very calling attention to the artifice of the musical. Is like from the opening scenes. Who's the audience? There's the audience in the film. There's you, the audience, watching this. We're going to call attention to all of these layers of what's going on right now. And in a rather funny games-esque thing, even implicate you. Like in that opening thing, the cast sings like, "We might even kill for you." Like it's, you know, and which implicating the audience, much as Henry McHenry is very troubled in the first half of the film with how his girlfriend turned wife is this opera singer who is always, as he says, like, you know, bowing and dying. Every night she dies for the audience and takes a bow. And he's very disturbed by this, which I think we will probably get into. And, you know, the audience, if they're paying attention, might be drawn to question things like, well, what's the relationship between me watching this film as paralleled with the relationship of the audience inside the film, watching the opera and Henry McHenry's show and all the news coverage of them, because they're like, humorously in the film, they're kind of a celebrity couple, which some critics are like, where's the like comedian opera singer celebrities? What opera singer is a celebrity these days? And I'm like, who gives a shit? Like, that's your problem with Annette? I don't know what to tell you. In this world, it is. Great. Mm-hmm. So there's all these like Entertainment Tonight type like news reports about them and their relationship, and you can see the public tide turning in various ways of how they feel about it. And that's, anyway, it's a point being, I think it's a very fundamentally different kind of musical than those other two.
It's fundamentally different than most musicals. Like, just structurally the type of music it's doing, the what it is. It's sort of, it's both being naturalistic at times in its scene construction while also being extremely theatrical in terms of its scene construction, and the music is not meant to be like, the music's not meant to like even represent dialogue. It's meant to be very, very much like, we're gonna tell you a thing, here's the thing. And
well, it's also,
I mean, it's more nuanced than that, but like lyrically it's often just
it's operating on an unusual level. Like with the "we love each other so much" thing, it becomes this thing where it's like they're repeating it for themselves. They're like, they're in love with being in love. They want to be in love. They're repeating it. It's like an incantation, bringing it to be.
Yeah.
Almost, which starts to call attention to like, well, do they? What does love mean to them? What does it mean to love each other so much? Are the kinds of questions the audience is kind of encouraged to ask of ourselves, because there is so little additional lyrical content to process. It's just repeating these very simple things, and the repetition begins to change the meaning, I think.
Yes.
So on Ebert.com, it appears that Ebert back in the day gave Little Murders 4 stars. And more recently, Sheila O'Malley, because Ebert, R.I.P., passed away some years ago, gave Annette 4 stars.
I mean, that just sounds like him making excuses.
Sure. So they were both well reviewed here. I was interested to see this because like they are both polarizing works. There's certainly neither of them is universally acclaimed, but it happens that these 2 checks we do every episode where we always are like, okay, what did the New York Times say? What did Ebert say? Like 2 long-running sources of film criticism that review a wide range of things and are very mainstream.
They were all positive.
They were all positive in this case. Yeah, and you know, is there anything in particular from here, Sean? I see you.
No, not necessarily. I just pulled the quote that we pulled in our research doc to make sure that we had it available. But I don't know that we necessarily, like, we can put the links in. But I think what's significant is what you just said, is that they are films that are very clearly the sort of thing that people are gonna hate because they're not by the numbers or straight like plots necessarily, and they're things where you're like, the hell did I just watch? And maybe a little bit less to Annette. I think Annette, probably people are just like, I think people might be mad about, you know, the Adam Driver character's position or whatever in terms of
people are mad
being the
about
protagonist.
Everything.
I'm sure
people are mad about the puppet. People are mad about the songs.
Why are they mad about the puppet?
People are mad about like his comedy bits. That's not realistic, because anything else in the film
First of all, some of it is definitely. Like,
I love how they did the comedy bits. I thought it was so smart.
We should talk about that some more in a second.
Yeah,
which is one of the reasons why I'm like, let's just say, you know, in fact, let's just like say, these were generally liked by critics. We can't do the thing we usually do where we get mad at critics for being not good at understanding that movies are good, because the critics understood these movies were good. Like
the ones we chose, at least. There are others that didn't, though. If you look up either of these movies, certainly Annette, there are people trashing it, and including critics. Absolutely.
Yeah. But our usual touchstones, which would show more like mainstream, I think, like confusion with films or disinterest in films, aren't. They're showing that they quite like them.
I do want to call attention to one sentence from the Ebert review of Little Murders, just because I think it's quite astute, which is Arkin makes Little Murders so much of a piece, so consistent on its own terms, that while you're watching it, it doesn't even feel like satire, just real life a little further down the road. Little Murders is a very 2021 movie, I'll say.
Yeah.
I was watching Little Murders and I was like, this is what life feels like right now. Not people shooting at me in New York City in some sort of urban crime way, but people just shooting up every place else in the fucking country, as well as there being a pandemic right outside waiting to get you, and people being in all sorts of levels of denial about that and not willing to do the bare minimum to try to not have their fellow citizens die and all of that. Like, you know, the past couple years, I watched Little Murders and I was just like, some of the specifics are different, but this is definitely the vibe.
This is just basically the same shit.
Yeah, I think Ebert was quite right to say a little down the road. And now we're here. Let's talk about Rotten Tomatoes, where Little Murders was 69% fresh with critics and 82% with audiences, in part because I would imagine at this point, anyone who's going to fucking watch Little Murders and write about it on Rotten Tomatoes is probably like going to have... They're not going to be like, what the fuck? Because they chose to watch Little Murders sometime in the past 15 years.
Exactly.
Annette is 71% fresh with critics, so kind of the same. And 72 fresh with audiences, so less. I'm actually surprised it's even that high. There must be like Adam Driver stands or something.
I'm sure there's some of that. I'm sure there's also a degree of like it flies under the radar of a lot of the people who would write stuff on Rotten Tomatoes that would mostly be to shit on it. Like, I feel like a lot of the people who probably are seeing it and don't care for it in the audiences aren't necessarily going on Rotten Tomatoes to write about it.
I've definitely come across a lot of negative reactions to that film.
Yeah, definitely. I can imagine.
Box office wise, it's almost not worth talking about. Little Murders cost $1.34 million and apparently made $1.5 million. So, hey, success. Jules Pfeiffer was nominated for Best Comedy Adapted from Another Medium in the Writers Guild Awards, did not win. Annette had an estimated budget of $15.5 million. Looks like it cost more than that, honestly. They made good use of that money. You definitely see that 15 million and hear that 15 million. But its worldwide gross was only about $3.5 million, although it was released this summer and it was simultaneously released on Amazon Prime. So, you know, like, not that that was going to be a blockbuster otherwise, but, you know, that... No. But it had a lot working against it box office wise, and it won a lot of awards. It won Best Director and Best Composer for Sparks at Cannes. It was nominated for the Palme d'Or, did not win. Leos Carax also won the Douglas Sirk Award at the Hamburg Film Festival, and Annette has been nominated for Best Music Themed Film, Biopic, or Musical at the Hollywood Music and Media Awards, and no doubt it will be nominated for more. We're recording this at the beginning of December 2021. I don't know if it's going to get Oscar nominations, but, you know, we're about to get heavy into award season, and it's a contender. It didn't really get the kind of traction where I think everyone's
I think it's going to depend on... Yeah, I think it's going to depend on how much Amazon wants to put it out there for that.
What do these films reflect about one another? We've been talking about that, as we usually do. What were you thinking, Sean, as somebody who's newer to both of them?
Well, because we were talking a little bit about the beginning about the ways in which they portray toxic masculinity. I think they look different. And I think there's ways in which they're definitely different, like, obviously. But I do think that they're kind of the same thing, though. Like, there's a kind of... Like, the passivity of Albert is, in some ways, a different manifestation of the same sort of thing that Henry McHenry's doing. Like, they both have this sort of spite for the world around them a little bit. Like, Albert's is like, oh, I'm apathetic, which is like, there's a real, like, I'm giving up sort of selfishness that's happening there.
Yes, what I was going to say is an abdication of responsibility. is one of the connections I see between them. It looks outwardly a little different, but it inwardly comes from this similar, like, you know, it's not my fault.
Exactly. Like Henry's career falls apart and he's blaming his wife. He's blaming the baby. He's raging against everybody else. He's blaming the audience when really what it is that it's his own, you know, his career starts to fall apart. This is one of my favorite parts, honestly. Like that second performance of his, is it the second? I think it's just the second like full performance you see of his.
This is why I wanted to do karaoke in Halloween, so I could do the meltdown song. All I want to do is do that meltdown song wearing a green robe, holding like a banana and a cigarette. This is all I want to do is
someday
like
we'll
cosplay.
Do it. Someday you can do it.
We'll make it happen.
And
I love it. I love that song.
I love
That's
it because
one I listen to on Spotify. That's one of the main ones I'll put on.
It's, you know, the song's one thing, but just that it's so timely, and it's going to keep being timely is the thing. Is like, it's the sort of thing that you see stand-ups do. Like there's definitely some recent stuff that has happened that is like this.
He's literally demanding of the audience, what's your problem? What's your fucking problem? And he's basically like, you used to laugh, but you sure ain't laughing at me no more. And then like goes on, and it's just basically like, you know, if you don't laugh for me, I'm going to get the fuck off this stage. You better laugh. You better clap. And there were bits of that in the first one where like they demand that you laugh and you clap and all that, but it's a little bit more everyone's having a good time. He just crossed a line where the audience is like, this is too far. This is too much. Now we're all uncomfortable, Henry McHenry. Before we were having an edgy good time, but you tipped over the edge. And now everyone's just kind of like, but rather than him doing a critique of his performance, how could he possibly do that? Because the reason he does comedy, as he tells us very self-servingly at the beginning of the film, is because it's the only way he can tell the truth without getting killed.
Right. Which is
bullshit.
And it's the parody of the comedian in it, of itself. And I like comedy and I like comedians up to a point. And that point is what happens with Henry McHenry in this film, which happens to so many comedians, some on a very large scale and some not so much on a large scale. But it happens to all of them, where basically they become separate from, they lose touch with like that core of what we, you know, when they do a good job, when they are the Henry McHenry we see at the beginning of the film, where they're touching on like common things, like things it's like, yep, I'm fucked up in that way too. Yep, I'm dealing with these problems too. And then they start to turn it against people or see themselves as in opposition to the audience, as opposed to being a part of that group, as a part of like this sort of community. And there's an expression of it. I mean, there's the hint there at the beginning of where he's like, oh, this is the only place I can tell the truth without getting killed, which is that hyperbole that you hear from many comedians about their importance culturally, which I don't completely disagree with. It's just when they start to talk about it.
But he's way more likely to kill somebody else for no fucking good reason than to come to him.
Exactly. And like it's that I'm just like, okay, this is good. And like the type of comedian he is and the type of style and the theatricality of it, like it all comes together sort of perfectly to represent that kind of person. And that kind of, I think that's why even though, I mean, I recognized it as a dream when she takes the nap and there's the press conference with all the women. But I think at the same time, I was like, okay, that's a dream, but like,
it's coming from
did
somewhere.
That happen? Or is that happening? Is that something that we're just dealing with as a dream, but it's like a real thing? Was it a thing before? Like, and I was just like, I'm just going to accept that. Like, for me, I just accepted it as a real thing that happened and that she happened to be dreaming about it. Like,
Yeah, I see it very differently. Not necessarily that it didn't happen or that similar things to what happens in the dream didn't happen. I'm sure they did. I'm sure, you know, he's treated women shitty. But the reason it's very clearly set up that, so what happens is she's in the backseat of a limo. There's news playing on a monitor on the back of the seat in front of her. She's watching the news. Right. She falls asleep. She has this dream where she sees a news report about how 6 women have come forward, each with a similar story regarding Henry McHenry and his abuses. And they sing this piece, these 6 women. And it culminates with them saying the reason we came forward now is because we want to warn Anne, like, you know, she's in danger, you know, etc. And she also, oh, I forgot. In the dream also, she wakes up and she falls asleep. She has a dream that she wakes up in the back of the limo and this is what's on the news now. And then at the end of it, she wakes up again, something completely different is on the news. So like that period is very clearly formally established as being a dream. My take on it is not that it's a dream of something she's seen before, but it's a dream that comes from her picking up on this uneasiness she's been singing about at various points. I love this man, but something's not right. Something feels off. You know, I don't know what it is. And her subconscious comes up with that because it's tapping into something real. Like it is about something real, whether or not, you know, any of those women in her dream exist. I don't think we have any reason to think those specific women exist. But I do think you're right that we do have reason to think that things like that have happened. Yeah. The reason I was so like meh about it is in part because I read a review where somebody faulted the film for having Henry McHenry get Me Too'd and then having the film forget about it. And I'm like, it didn't happen.
I actually like that's one of the reasons why I like interpreting that it did happen, because it's not shocking to me that it would have been forgotten.
No, it's not shocking to me that it would have been forgotten. I'm just saying formally, the thing where we learn about that happened in a dream.
Yeah, no, I know. Yeah.
I have no problem believing it would have been forgotten too, but I don't, you know, I think that is a wrong-headed grounds on which to criticize the film because somebody misinterpreted something that happened in the plot. That's all.
No, I
agree with you
I
that
agree with that. It's
supposed to be coming from somewhere. And I mean, ultimately, he fucking kills her.
Yeah.
Like he's more dangerous than she could have fucking imagined. And he makes her laugh, right? That's so much of why they connect. And I found it so powerful that I believed them being together. I believed their relationship.
It's very believable.
I believed their chemistry. She doesn't, and he's on his best behavior with her during the honeymoon period, because when we first meet them, they're in the honeymoon period.
Exactly.
And they're infatuated with one another. And then the second shit gets real, he starts falling apart and being a dick. And he's in denial about it himself. You know, it starts coming out in his dreams. He has some disturbing dreams and things like that. It starts coming out in his work. You know, what he's actually thinking about, but he won't take responsibility for it. I wanted to speak, though, to, you were saying, we were talking about foreshadowing about the, like, killing, being killed stuff. When we first see them together, well, we first see them together actually in that opening number where the actors kind of take on their roles and the film starts. But then, you know, we see them separately. They both go off. Anne goes and does her opera. Henry McHenry goes off and does his comedy show. And then he rides his motorcycle to meet her and they kiss in front of the paparazzi. And they ask each other how they, you know, how they did. And Henry McHenry says, I killed them. That's how he refers to his relationship with his audience. He says, I killed them. And Anne says, good boy. And he says, how did you do? And she says, I saved them. Which is, there's a lot of interesting stuff about the parallels between their two characters, which are also very much about the roles that men and women get to play in cultural life and art and things like that. And her role is to be the martyr, to be the kind, innocent, pure, loving, all these, you know, cult of white femininity fetishized aspects. That's her. She's also, you know, has a great voice, or it wasn't Marion Cotillard singing the opera bits, but whoever, I'll find the name, whoever sings them sounds fucking amazing. It sounds amazing. and she dies over and over again for them. Whereas Henry McHenry sees himself as inflicting, taking his anger and inflicting it outwards on the audience, not absorbing theirs.
Right.
But the other way, to the point where even when he does this play on it, where he, in the opening bit, fakes like he got shot on stage, basically, to the point where almost everybody in the audience is freaked out. Not everyone. Some people are like, oh, I get it. But most people, because it goes on so long, are like, is he actually dead? But he's not. And then he gets up and he's like, see, I can die on stage too. But even when he dies on stage, he's doing it in this confrontational way against the audience, kind of in opposition to the audience, not to like take on their whatever the way Anne does.
Yeah, and it's also an interesting look at the difference between male and female roles, but also somewhat, and I don't want to, that sounded almost essentialist, but assigned roles or permitted roles.
And archetypes, which this film...
And archetypes. But also, like, to a certain degree, even, like, the professions and how those get us also associated in sort of a gender way. Like, there's the whole thing which comes up at least once a year. Some jackass is like, women aren't funny. It's like, shut up. But because stand-up is a very male-dominated space, even though lots of thousands, millions of stand-up comedians who are women, like, I say male-dominated in the sense of, like, who's allowed to have chances.
Right.
Not who's out
good.
there doing
Yeah.
there. Not
For
who's
sure.
good. Certainly not who's good. Definitely not who's good. Because honestly, most male comedians are doing the same show.
But who's gatekeeping and who's being let through those gates? Absolutely.
Exactly. Who's gatekeeping, who's being let through those gates. Like, it's very male dominated in that sense, and in a lot of ways. And that keeps coming up as a problem. And then acting, which is different. Because...
And not just acting, but singing and angelic
singing. Yeah. And that as well. But like because like, and this is to address what you're saying about how she saves people, is like the actor doesn't necessarily confront the audience, but represents is a vessel for the audience to experience something and to experience a catharsis, which is,
Yes.
Which there's sort of these different approaches to it. Like, there's an approach to comedy that is more cathartic as well. I think I've seen that, like, honestly, like, the work of Bo Burnham, I think, is a much more cathartic form of stand-up comedy, because he doesn't really necessarily, he's actually more of just sort of a performance artist than even a stand-up, but it's a mix of things. But still, like, there's a way of doing that. But it's that performer, like, representing the audience thing, and there's the approach to the world, because it's also like in how they interact with the press the first time they meet up, as in character. The first time they meet up, she's very open to them, and he puts down his mask because he doesn't want to, he tries to separate. And so there's a lot of that there. And then if we go to Little Murders and we got our characters there, I think that Alfred is Alfred. Damn it. Alfred is very similar. Like, his way of doing it is like, oh, just let it happen. Just let it happen.
Being shut off, though.
It's
about being shut off.
It's about being shut off, but it's that same. It's the same. Like, it's the same. Okay, I'm choosing not to engage with this. Henry McHenry's performance is confrontational, but really just in this way where he's like on stage doing a thing at you, but you're separated from him still.
Like he still is not, he's not having an emotional exchange with you. He's not having a physical exchange with you, well, until he throws that thing at the guys at the audience. He literally throws some stuff at the audience. Yeah. But like that's not,
but that's when he's melting down. That's not a
that's
normal
the
part
burn
of
the
his
melt.
act.
You're right. But like it's like there's that separation. I think there's that same separation with Alfred. Is like they're doing the same thing in different ways. Even like the way Alfred's like, oh, I take pictures of shit, is a sort of like passive confrontation. It's a very passive aggressive sort of thing. He's like, this is my art. My art is taking pictures of shit.
Whereas Patsy's trying to engage. I mean, in a way you can argue is very steeped in denial in a way that, you know, Anne's isn't in the same way. Anne's might be in denial in some ways, but not the way Patsy is. But Patsy does have a point where she gives this monologue that's quite good, where she says something like, yes, bad things happen constantly, but for every bad thing, there's 5 good things. I'm not going to let the people doing the bad things stop me from enjoying all the good things. And she has a point. It's kind of psychotic, the degree she takes it to, but she has a point. And there's something compelling about it. And it's about saying, I am not willing to shut myself off from life. I'm going to be open so that I can enjoy all that life has to offer. Even as more and more fucked up stuff is coming in this room, I'm still going to pay attention. You know, I get to choose where I put my attention. Why would I focus on the bad stuff when I can focus on the good stuff?
Yeah.
It's not that different from a lot of actual like self-help and life coaching stuff that's really no more reasonable than what she says. Hers is a lot more appealing to me because at least she comes to it honestly.
Yeah, I mean, I think they both have, you know, both Alfred and Patsy both have like standpoints that have their positives. Like Alfred's like, I'm just gonna roll with it. Is not an entirely bad thing.
No,
it's the degree to which he does
aspects of it.
Yeah, because sometimes it's just like literally. Sometimes he is just right. Sometimes
association can be a really, really helpful survival technique.
Yeah, well, and also just like sometimes, no matter what you do or say, they're still going to beat the shit out of you. So you might as well just let it happen and get it over with. Like sometimes it's just what it is. But she's also right in that, you can't let all the shit get to you all the time. You have to find a way to pull your focus and find the things that make you happy. Whatever.
He's just surviving.
They're both right. Exactly. They're both right and they're both
just
wrong.
Surviving. Yeah. And also, you know, you can't fix people. These films are both kind of about how women can't fix men, but nobody can fix anybody. No. Romantic relationships don't fix people. No. They can be sites of support.
And children don't
things
fix
like
people.
Oh, children definitely fucking don't fix people. As we saw in Annette, didn't get to see that in Little Murders, but I think they are both portraits of a version of idealized, romanticized, heterosexual romantic relationship, even though in Little Murders they're both totally fucked. But it's like, and it's both like, this is what's going to elevate the fucked up guy and help him to not be so fucked up, because isn't that what happened, Sean? Like, guys just need to grow up and like get a wife and a child and like get their priorities straight, and then they'll be better, right? That's how it fucking works.
There's a lot of ways in which Little Murders, and I mean I think this was already happening, but it became more of a thing about 20 years after, is kind of a model for every sitcom of the 90s. It's like a dude who's kind of like, I don't know, is like, he's disconnected from things. He doesn't find joy in things, whatever. And then there's a woman who does. I mean, she's almost a manic pixie dream girl. Like,
yes, except that this film then kills her.
Yes. That's why
which is why it's like the opposite of a manic pixie narrative.
Yeah.
Because they're like, no.
It's criticizing what this, other things are lionizing it, or not lionizing, but celebrating the relationship, and saying like the thing of like, either they fall on the side of the woman can change the man and the man does want to change, or they fall on the side of, she shouldn't try to change him and she should accept him for what he is. I think more often than not, it's the latter. Every once in a while, it's the former. Rarely do you find one where they kind of meet in the middle, which is honestly one of the reasons why I always liked Knocked Up, is they kind of end up somewhere in the middle and Knocked Up. But it has the same sort of, Knocked Up has almost the same sort of setup. Like Seth Rogen is kind of that sort of apathetic idiot. In a
Katherine
different sort of
Hagel's
sense.
character is not like loving life, though. She's just
she's not
I've got
loving
my
life.
shit together, and he's a schlub. I
Yeah.
saw this so long ago. That's my memory of it.
Yeah, I mean it's been a long time, but yeah,
She's like
but it's a
more-
similar model.
But she's kind of like more the ball-busting bitch type archetype career girl, as I recall, whereas Patsy's the like starry-eyed. But I agree with you. I'm not disagreeing with your overall.
No, they're different archetypes of it for sure. They're different archetypes of it for sure. But like it's the same dynamic of she's trying to change him and he's not. But ultimately they kind of fall. Like the only reason I brought it up is because it's one of the few ones where in the end it's not about one or the other, but they actually find like an equilibrium.
Gotcha. I don't remember the film well enough, but that all sounds right. The thing you were saying,
it's a divergence, but yeah.
It's great. I'm just, the sitcom thing that you were talking about is really interesting, because that's a thing I think about a lot, and I feel like what's so good about both these films is it's like this sitcom dynamic of like the kind of schlubby dumb guy and the wife who's kind of got it more together and is always like, you need to, not feed the baby donuts for dinner. It's kind of the genre that's, it's a subgenre of like, are straight people okay, basically, as far as I'm concerned. Because it's like, I think it speaks to really toxic dynamics that we all see in a lot of heterosexual relationships. Not so much really among like my friend group, because it's whenever I encounter it, I'm like, why are you all married though then? If you fucking hate each other, don't get married. Like there's so many fucking straight women who fucking hate men, and I'm not saying it's all for bad reasons. There's always some good reasons to hate men, but I'm like, why did you marry someone you hate? Stop dating people you don't like. Good rule for everybody of every gender. But there's this idea we have, and it makes sense because of like the history of heterosexual romance and marriage and having kids. And like, this is how we continue to perpetuate our shitty society. Like, of course you have to do this. This is doing your part. And certainly being a woman, that's your part. That's your most important thing you can have. Like, for a lot of women, depending on your class location and things like that, for a while, it's like, yeah, at a certain point, you're not even supposed to have a job at all. Like, this is your job. And so we get a lot of miserable people where that's not necessarily what they wanted, but they were indoctrinated into it from a very young age. And so they're doing it. There are a lot of people who are married who don't want to be married, who have kids they don't want to have. That wasn't my path. I early on was like, nope. I am married now, but as you know, married someone after 15 years. Because at first we were like, we don't want to get married. That's a whole other thing. But like
there's tax benefits.
Sitcoms, the more money you make, the more tax benefits there are if you're married. This is a big digression I want to get into. What I did want to say is that what sitcoms don't do is I feel that sitcoms are this kind of pressure tension reliefs, the kind of sitcoms you're talking about that have these kinds of relationships in them, so that everyone who's in a miserable relationship can look and laugh at the sitcom and laugh at their misery and have a bit of a release and be like, that's just how it is. I've heard straight people say what are to me crazy things to other straight people about like their fucked up relationships and be like, oh yeah, I know, that's just how it is, men, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, I married a man, and if I felt that way about men, I would not be married to a man. I luckily have that option. I am not solely attracted to men. So like if I just fucking don't. Like, and sitcoms don't do the audience the honesty of showing that actually Annette and Little Murders, that's kind of where this dynamic goes.
Yeah.
But the sitcoms are this like lie, this big myth of our culture that's very important about like family. And by family, we mean like heterosexual, patriarchal, nuclear family. There might be some exceptions. Maybe there's like one gay family in your circle of like 20 families, you know, with married, probably white, you know, upper middle class gay people who are very respectable or whatever. But overall, but it's a heteropatriarchal structure. And it's like, we all got to do it. It sucks sometimes, but that's part of the beauty of it. And that's what family is. And all this weird, like, romantic mythology about family getting bundled up with these toxic elements as if you can't have one without the other. And I'm here to tell you, you can. And many people do. But it's this myth we need to get. And Annette and Little Murders are like, well, this is where this goes. The woman ends up dead. It's, you know, it's sometimes people are like, want to argue that those shows are feminist in some way because like, oh, the woman's smarter. And I'm like, no, that's a patriarchal stereotype that helps keep women in line and doing their part, basically, and gives men a get out of jail free card so that they don't have to take responsibility for all sorts of things. Because it's like, what can I say? I'm just a dumb guy. This ultimately benefits men, not women.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
But if in the immediacy, it doesn't look like it's sexist because it's like, oh, well, it's sexist against the guy. The woman's the one with. And these films show, you know, actually the deadly results of these dynamics of like women being the one to keep it together and men being able to be kind of like, oh, well, I'm just a dumb guy who doesn't have my shit together. And I need the woman who's better and more loving and, you know, more empathetic and more connected to the, you know, to save me and keep me connected to my own humanity.
And also just like the self-centeredness that happens there and the as you described it earlier, narcissism that happens with Henry McHenry and how he's like, well, if I can't be famous anymore, I'm going to be famous by proxy through my daughter, through Annette, through my puppet. Yeah. And he doesn't see. So the conductor who had been Anne's accompanist, who we learn at a certain point, had an affair with her that ended as soon as she got together with Henry. Then that ended, and he's, you know, quietly been pretty unhappy about this. He and Henry have this like great song together when Henry first invites the accompanist over to hear Annette sing because he's like, I want you to play music while we tour because I can't do that. So you, he calls him like my conductor friend. He doesn't have a name. He's just the accompanist, and then he's the conductor. And Henry McHenry just keeps calling him my conductor friend. And Henry doesn't pick up on any of the complex emotions that the conductor's having about all this, which upon further viewing, you see it like he alludes to the fact that he thinks he might be Annette's father in his first song, I believe. And Henry doesn't pick up on any of this because it doesn't behoove him to, because his head's too far up his own ass. Yeah. Nobody else exists as a three-dimensional, fully emotional person in his presence. Not even Anne. Anne was the closest, but still, he saw her as an object. He was either in awe of her or he was angry and resentful. But she wasn't a full person with her own full psychology who he could talk to honestly. He either had to put her up on a pedestal and worship her or literally knock her down, which is a thing that's bigger than Henry McHenry. And a quick note on his name. I haven't seen anyone say this, but I have to imagine, or I at least like to imagine, that it's a Lolita reference. It's a who reference?
Lolita to Humbert.
Oh, okay, got it. I just didn't hear the word.
Yeah, because Henry McHenry is such a ridiculous name. And, you know, both starting with H, basically same name twice, but with a Mick before the second one. And I feel like that has to be a little bit of a tipping of the hand to like, this is an unreliable narrator. We are centering a story around a fucked up guy, and you can't trust his version of things. That's what I got from it. I could be wrong, but it just seemed like, I don't know, Sparks seem like fairly literate guys. I feel like they've got to know about Lolita. and like one of the
definitely
most
think they would.
famous examples of an unreliable narrator in literary
Even if
history.
it's not explicitly that, I think like the end result, I think you're still picking up on, I think, what they want.
Yeah.
Even if they're referring to something else, which they might be.
They might be, but
Or they
yeah,
might
I mean,
be
that's what
referring to that. I don't know. But like either
but
way.
I think it works even if you didn't know the name Humbert Humbert. I feel like you hear Henry McHenry, and that's not like Anne. Anne's name is like Anne de la Fourneau, I think. It's not that everyone has a meaningful name, but they're very different. You know, like Anne and then Annette, literally Little Anne. And I don't know if we talked about this, but part of what's going on is Annette becomes a ghost story. Anne continues to be in the film, but as a ghost haunting Henry, in part through Annette's voice. She gives her voice to Annette. Does this happen literally? Is this a dream? I don't think it really matters.
No.
It is literally the same voice coming out of baby Annette. And so her gift is also haunting Henry, and he also needs to like control it, obviously. Like, how else is he going to deal with it? In a way that parallels, in many respects, his relationship to the mother. And there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there. But point being, the names are all really intentional. Anne, Annette, the conductor, Henry McHenry. What are we to make of these names? I think Henry McHenry calls attention to like,
Yeah.
what's real here? Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
No, I think I think that's interesting. I mean, I think that his name there, and speaking of Sparks, when we were talking about the song "We Love Each Other So Much" and the repetition there, I mean, definitely listening to that, I was reminded, like watching the movie and listening to that, I was reminded of probably the song that stood out to me the most in the documentary about them, Sparks, the Edgar Wright documentary that came out earlier this year, was their song "My Baby Is Taking Me Home," which is literally just that phrase repeated over and over again. One of the things that's so interesting about what they do, and you know, one of the reasons I was interested in this as a musical, because I was like, they have a very distinctive musical style, like for what they do, where I'm like, I get why they never gained like mass popularity, but why they've always maintained a career, because they have this very particular way about them. And this "My Baby Is Taking Me Home," which I definitely recommend that our audience listen to, is just that phrase repeated over and over and over again to the music, and it shifts and it changes. And sometimes he doesn't necessarily change the way he sings it. It just changes for you as it's going. And there are moments in that song where it is very, very sad. It feels very sad, but then suddenly it's not necessarily that sad. It's sort of uplifting. The song kind of has these waves to it, and it's very I think one of the things, Edgar Wright, I follow him on Twitter because he's interesting to follow on Twitter, because mostly because he just really loves films, so he'll just talk about stuff that's coming. Oh, this is coming up on TV. I really love this film. You know, is anybody else watching this with me? Stuff like that. But also he, you know, after we saw the documentary, he's like, for those of you who never heard of the band before, what song stuck out to you? And I know I responded with that one, but he mentioned, I don't think he responded to me, but I think he mentioned in a separate thing that like a lot of people, like that one was the one that stood out for them. And I think that, to come back to this, when I was watching the scene with the "We Love Each Other So Much," I was getting, you know, you're getting that vibe from that. And I think it's an execution of that style of song that works that works very well in context here, because it's that thing of, I think we all recognize it at some point, like maybe in our teens, maybe earlier. It's like, if you repeat a word enough times, it loses all meaning for you. It's like you're just
it doesn't mean, like, a word just can stop meaning anything. Well, a phrase sung enough times actually, instead of losing its meaning, starts to, as you were saying, it gains layers of meaning. And then then this has the visual context, it has the musical context, and it starts to feel sort of structurally, as in terms of the song, in terms of the scenes, like, and I think you were saying this a bit earlier, is that it at times starts to sound like they're convincing themselves of it, almost as much as they're expressing it. They are trying to convince themselves that this is a thing, which I think also plays into what you were saying about the relationship structures that it's reflecting on, is that there's a lot of those relationships where people spend a lot of their time convincing themselves that they love each other, or that they love each other in the way that they're quote unquote supposed to.
It is a mirror on the audience. Or not, I don't, mirror's maybe not the best way of talking about it, but the audience, maybe it's more of a screen onto which the audience
I think
can
we need
project.
I think we need to say mirror because it's the name of our show.
Right. So sure, it's a mirror and it's going to reflect back to the audience what they're looking into it. Sure. Great.
Sure,
but point being, like, I'm aware that, like, I'm bringing this meaning to it, but that's what it's inviting the audience to do. It's inviting the audience to bring meaning to the moment. You could watch that scene and just be like, they really love each other.
So much.
Yeah, so much. And you wouldn't be wrong. It's just that there's more there.
Yeah.
And I did also that My Baby's Taking Me Home song. I watched the Sparks Brothers documentary yesterday in preparation for this, and I definitely thought about Annette in general, and specifically We Love Each Other So Much when they discussed that song as well, because I think you're absolutely right. It's a similar thing, and that's a part of what they bring to it, as well as a kind of wordplay and irony in general to their songwriting, which is common in pop music. You know, there's a lot of songs that sound happy but are actually sad when you listen to the lyrics. That's a very common way of approaching pop music. And there's some of that with them, but that's not really what I mean so much as there's stuff where you can look at it one way, but the more you look at it, the more you start to see, oh, actually there's other ways to look at this. There are all these little tells. There are all these little, you know, there's a little bit of not a puzzle exactly, but there's stuff for you to put together.
Yeah.
That change the picture. And I think that's true of at least a lot of Annette as well. It's a much more brutal movie than I was, like, emotionally. I feel like it is very tough but fair.
Yeah. It doesn't like soften any of its edges.
It didn't give me any of the things that I wanted from it when I was watching it in terms of comfort.
No.
I wanted to be comforted.
Yeah.
I wanted Adam, like, quite frankly, I'm not proud of this reaction, but watching it initially, like, a part of me really wanted Adam Driver's character to be redeemed.
Well, and
I am so glad they didn't. I am so glad they didn't.
I agree with you, and I think it's interesting. One of the articles that we pulled earlier, I was reading, and I've forgotten which one it is, but one of the articles pulled that we were reading was talking about very specifically Adam Driver as a leading man. One, it was comparing him to leading men of, like, the 60s and 70s, or 50s even. Like, it was comparing him at one point to Robert Mitchum.
Right.
Because he does have sort of a different look. He's a handsome man, but he has a very different kind of look from, like, traditional Hollywood, or not traditional Hollywood handsome, current Hollywood concepts of handsome men, which is very
weird looking by traditional Hollywood. That said, I think he's extremely attractive.
Yeah,
I find
and it's generally, yeah.
I am very attracted to Adam Driver. Sorry.
Yeah. No.
That's just how it is.
Yeah.
Like,
but you're not alone in that. He's an attractive man. I do think he's an attractive man. But there's one of the things that we're talking about is he just has a natural charisma to him. And
Yes.
I think that's what works
It's an
about it.
odd
It's great
charisma.
casting. Well, there's a
not
frank
George Clooney
confidence to
charisma.
it. No, there's a frank confidence to it. There's I don't know how to describe it exactly, but
He's very
it's that
present and embodied, honestly,
yeah.
in this way. And he has a physicality that's different from a lot. On Girls, at one point, a character described him as looking like an old-timey pickpocket, which is a description that's really stuck in my head as being very astute in a way.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, yeah, I can actually picture him in some like Charles Dickens getup.
Yeah. But like, yeah, he's got this thing where he feels very real. You know, as you say, like he embodies characters that he plays, but he does a thing. He doesn't do Gary Oldman sort of chameleon thing, which Gary Oldman doesn't do as well as he used to.
No, he's always very much Adam Driver.
He's very much Adam Driver, but it's like
you don't forget it's Adam Driver, but
no, but he has sort of it is much more like a Robert Mitchum or a Cary Grant or something like that, where they were always who they were, but they would play sort of a different version of that. Like,
and he's got
sort of a better version of Tom Cruise.
Oh god,
So.
he's got more range, I think, but he also has a kind of lane. Like there's continuity between this role and Marriage Story, which I did not like, but I did watch a little bit of it, which I'll explain why in a second. And Kylo Ren, frankly, in Star Wars, like he's really, or actually
his character in
on
The Dead Don't
Girls.
Die.
Yeah, or frankly, his character on Girls as well. Like he's good at playing a certain kind of usually asshole of a sort. There are different variations, but they're all really different is the thing. It's not like, oh, that's that Adam Driver part. It's funny. I did watch a chunk of Marriage Story recently after, because when Sondheim died, actually, I was like, oh, I want to watch the scene in Marriage Story where Adam Driver sings Sondheim. And I went back a little before it because that scene, you don't have to watch the whole movie at all. If you want to get both all of the best and all of the worst of Marriage Story, I can give you some timestamps and say, just watch these 10 minutes from this to this. Watch like basically the scene before the Adam Driver Sondheim scene where Scarlett Johansson also sings a Sondheim number, which I had completely forgotten happened, which tells you a lot about some of the problems with Marriage Story, frankly. And then he does it. His scene is, frankly, I think it's a great scene. It makes me angry because I'm like, this scene is so much better than the entire rest of this movie, and also shows why this scene is such bullshit, because fucking Noah Baumbach has to rely on Stephen Sondheim to do the heavy lifting in his writing. Like, it's cheating, basically, to have the song he does from Company called Being Alive. And because if you know that show, the context he's singing it in is kind of the inverse of the context the character in the show is singing it, because the character in the show is singing it as this like permanent bachelor guy who's starting to open himself up to like, maybe I would want to open myself up to another person someday and not just be closed off and, you know, never get married. Whereas Adam Driver sings this song with his theater friends in like a piano, not a piano bar, but like a restaurant, being a dick also right after he signed his divorce papers. So he's singing this song that in context, and because Adam Driver plays it so brilliantly, despite the fact that I didn't give a shit about this movie, that scene can make me cry because Adam Driver, with the context of what you know, where you know his character's at, and his performance of that song is amazing. And I think Noah Baumbach can take a little bit of credit for that, for like having the idea. But the fact that nothing else in the film remotely approaches that idea for me in quality kind of is like, yeah, you cheated. You know, had Sondheim come in and fucking pinch hit for you, basically. Good job. You know, but also, I love to see Adam Driver sing. He's one of those actors who's not a singer, who I think does a fantastic job whenever he sings and doesn't make me mad. And you know, I sometimes get mad when non-singers sing in musicals. You better be, if you're a non-singer singing in a musical, you got to be like Rick Moranis or Adam Driver or, you know, something of that line. Having parts
Definitely
to sing
not
that.
Russell Crowe.
Definitely not Russell Crowe. Definitely not Johnny Depp.
Oh yeah.
Don't get me started on Sweeney Todd. Although now I kind of understand why some people like the Sweeney Todd movie, because I've seen some other Sondheim movies recently that are real fucking bad. And I'm like, oh, at least that one was doing something. Didn't like what it was doing. But it's a funny thing happened on the way to the forum, I'll tell you what.
Anyway. Yeah, no, he's a very good actor. He's very good at sort of sucking you in and creating you engage with his characters, like you sympathize with his characters. He just builds that very well.
It's a little bit.
It works well in this movie. I think he's well cast in this movie, and Annette for that, because like it wouldn't work as well. And I think people get mad at it because they probably did empathize with him, sympathize with him. Like, oh, I want him to get better. So they get mad at the movie.
Right.
Because he
Instead
doesn't.
of taking a look at themselves and being like, wow, it's kind of fucked up, because actually, I mean, to me, it just speaks to how good his performance is and how human he felt in this highly artificial, stylized production, that I wanted that. I wanted that because he was feeling like a person I knew.
It's also a much more effective way of criticizing the structure that the movie's criticizing, because those people are sympathetic people sometimes. They're not always terrible monsters. They're your friends sometimes. Like they're which, you know, just to go back to the thing, comedians, it's like, yeah, that person made you laugh. Yeah, that person has things that you really relate to, or, you know, has a history of whatever that is maybe reflected in how they're being fucked up right now, and then being on the other side of it. But that doesn't mean they're not wrong, or that they haven't done something wrong. They haven't hurt other people in this context. It's like he needs to be sympathetic. Because
he's not manslaughtering people all the time.
Exactly. He didn't manslaughter me.
Nobody is. It's like when people are like, well, this person didn't sexually assault me. And it's like, they don't sexually assault everyone they ever meet. Also, most people who are serial abusers very intentionally show a side of them to a bunch of people so that they've got like their crowd who's like, I would never. Like Marilyn Manson did. There's those people who are like, Marilyn Manson, I never saw him do. Oh, why would you have?
It's, but anyway.
We talked about these movies, though.
We did talk about these movies. And, you know, and all the things that we've said about Annette, which I think is, you know, it's true of Little Murders in a lot of similar ways, where Alfred, I keep wanting to call him Albert. Alfred is the same, is just a slight variation on what Henry McHenry is. You know, his art form is just not as whatever, but structurally, like the relationship thing is the same thing as you were saying. And
there is a parallel in the careers there, I think, in that she's like an interior decorator, interiors, domestic, etc., traditionally feminine career. He's a photographer. He's gazing on the world and interpreting. He's the artist, and it's, you know, external. Yeah, hers is more in whatever, like kind of talking out my ass here, but also
no.
They are gendered careers.
Very much so. Very much so. And I think that's true across both of them. And I think they're both very, very good deconstructions of those dynamics for the characters. And I think this was, you know, I wouldn't always necessarily, there's plenty of the movies that we watch that I would say, you know, watch this if you kind of are entertained by it, or if you're entertained by what we talked about, if you haven't watched it already, or reconsider some of these movies. There's not a whole lot that I would necessarily just recommend, like, oh, you should just watch this, like, because I'm careful about my recommendations. Usually I'm like, you shouldn't watch Funny Games.
I mean, that one for
stuff like that. Or it's like, you know what? Yeah, you probably shouldn't watch Transformers the movie because you don't appreciate cartoons or something. Like you kind of are going to write it off as a cartoon, or you're not going to like that as Weird Al movie. I think that these two are both ones that most people should watch.
Yeah, they're not necessarily going to like them.
No, and I think it's acceptable if you don't like them. Like, it's like, but think about why you don't like them. Like,
they're both very interesting and very unique movies. Neither one of them is really, other than that they're like each other, clearly we think in certain ways, but also they're clearly very, very different movies.
Yeah.
You're not going to mistake one for the other.
Yeah.
And you're not going to mistake either of them for anything else, at least nothing else I've seen.
And I think it helps to have an awareness of, like, I mean, Annette has a relatively straightforward structure. Like, it has a relatively straightforward 3-act structure, like you would expect from a lot of movies. Wow.
Much like an opera. It's very
opera.
operatic. Yeah. It's a tragedy, it's an operatic tragedy.
And then, but Little Murders is going to be awkward to watch because, I mean, it has something there, but it doesn't have the right feel for that because it is that 70s, that time in the 70s, before it became, before people were turning screenwriting into college curriculum and
formula.
Stuff like that. And formulas and saving cats and stuff like that, where they were like, well, we got kind of like this stretch of sequences and scenes that come together to make a film. One of the articles that we read was comparing one Godard was asked to shoot the film first before Alan Arkin
could see that.
Took it on. And they compared it to a couple of his films and the use of like explosions and bullets and sort of a post-apocalyptic feel in both Masculine Feminine, which I have not seen, and Weekend,
you should see.
which I should probably see that one. Weekend, which I have seen, and I actually teach that one.
I haven't seen Weekend, weirdly.
Weekend is weird.
I mean, it's Godard. His shit's weird.
Yeah.
I like Godard a lot. I'm kind of more recent stuff. It's just it is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
I like I like that he's fucking going for it that he's just fucking going for it. And sometimes I really respond to it. Sometimes I'm left somewhat cold, but I like the adventure and journey of that with Godard, frankly.
I don't have a strong relationship to his films at all. Like Weekend is probably the one that I'm like, yeah, no, I really like this one. It's actually the only one I saw in a theater. It was playing at a theater in the somewhere west side of Manhattan, like a decade ago. And my friend was like, we gotta go see Weekend. My friend David, who's the one who, whenever I'm like, yeah, there's some weird movie that I saw, it's usually he's the one who's like, Sean, this is your movie, like, go see this movie with me.
They played his stuff a lot in the before times. I'd go see his shit at Film Forum. They'd play
that might have been where we
Godard
saw it.
quite a bit there. They play a lot of Godard there, or have historically at least. So I wouldn't be surprised.
But it definitely has a similar feel to that movie.
Which
less
makes
chaotic
sense,
than Weekend.
That was also right around when Hollywood was kind of catching up to the French New Wave in a lot of ways, right? With like Bonnie and Clyde and things like that had a lot in common with some of the stuff that had been coming out of France specifically.
Yeah, it's
obviously this is based on a play,
but
and so stuff actually got interesting for a minute. But yeah, I could see Godard. That I think that's a very valid point of reference in terms of like a piece of this, but it's also not a Godard film. It is like his stuff and some of the unpredictability of like the first time I watched it, like that scene where Elliott Gould goes over to Patsy's house for dinner. At a certain point, like my husband and I turned to each other and we're like, this scene's been going on a really long time. Not because we were bored, just because we're like,
weird because it's going on. Yeah.
Because we notice and it is so even for like turn of the 70s when scenes, I feel like a lot of stuff pacing wise was, less formulaic, less regimented, but even for its time, it was like very notable that it just was like a 30-minute long scene basically. And you're like, it's still going. It's still,
Yeah.
you know what? Why not? Why not? I'm paying attention. I certainly don't think it hurts this film to disorient, to make the audience feel a bit disoriented and unsure of where they stand. I don't think that harms the film at all.
No.
Yeah, I think people should watch. Obviously, I like both these films. I like Little Murders a lot. Annette, I just love. It's just become one of my favorite films. It's just one of those that does it for me, and I like to watch. And sometimes I'm like, I'm just gonna put on Annette. Like, one of the times I watched it, I didn't even mean to watch the whole thing. I was like, I just want to see that opening number again. But then, of course, I got sucked in, and I'm just like, watch the whole fucking thing. Because it's a good movie. And Leos Carax is a super interesting filmmaker in general, but this is also both has things in common with the other stuff I've seen of his, and is also completely distinct and different.
Yeah.
Like,
I've only seen Holy Motors.
he did this movie that wasn't that great, Tokyo, that also had a bit by Bong Joon-ho. It was an anthology, and had one also by Michel Gondry, I think, did the other one. But he has this bit that is continuous with a bit from Holy Motors. If you remember the monster bit from Holy Motors, the sewer monster character.
Yeah.
Tokyo Tokyo predated that and has
I remember
has a
hearing
bit
about
with that character as well. It's not a great film, but it's interesting to watch for sure, because those filmmakers are all interesting.
Okay.
I think the Bong Joon-ho one was by far the most successful overall, as I recall.
Okay.
But yeah, what else?
I guess I only saw Holy Motors. And Annette.
All I've seen is Annette, Holy Motors, and Tokyo. But I will watch all his other shit, because one, there's a bunch of good actors in it, and two, he's just doing interesting enough stuff that I'll watch it. Like, I mean, this I loved, and Holy Motors I loved. So, like, I'm late coming to this. I know he's been working for decades. He only kind of makes a couple films a decade. And I look forward to exploring them. Alan Arkin, I'm more familiar with a lot of his work.
Yeah. I don't know if I'm familiar with stuff he's directed, but obviously Alan Arkin in general is
Alan,
very familiar with him. So
wait, did he direct anything else actually? Let me oh yeah, he did. Yeah, he directed a bunch of stuff I've never heard of. Like People Soup and wait, People Soup was before Little Murders? I thought it was his directorial debut then. Maybe it was a short. Anyway, Alan Arkin directed some stuff. Now we know.
And that's a thing that happens.
That's a thing that happens. And now you know. This has been the Celluloid Mirror.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for joining us. We'll catch you later. Bye.
Bye-bye. The Celluloid Mirror is a 4 Mile Circus production hosted by Nicole Solomon and Sean Mannion. Our theme music is Twisted by Kevin MacLeod. You can hear more from Kevin MacLeod at incompetech.filmmusic.io. Please take a few moments to rate and review the Celluloid Mirror on your podcast platform of choice. It really helps with discoverability. If you have questions or comments about what you heard on the show or suggestions for future episodes, feel free to email us at info@4milecircus.com or seek us out on social media. We are at 4 Mile Circus on Twitter and Instagram. Want more from the Celluloid Mirror? Sean and Nicole join our Patreon at patreon.com/4milecircus. You'll get early access to episodes, uncut video of our recording sessions, access to our Discord server, and much more. To learn more about everything we do, visit us at 4milecircus.com.
I ended up in that hall of mirrors. There was another girl. She looked like me. Exactly like me.
Can you come with me in my dreams?
That'll do, Pink.
happens when the story dies. The evil is set free.
I have to return some videotapes.